My department chair stole my research for a federal grant. Forgetting my copyright filing already proved everything. I came up the hard way in academic research. Not hard the way people say it casually. Hard the way that means your first published paper took 4 years. Your grant proposals were rejected 6 times before one finally came through. And your dissertation committee included at least one man who openly questioned whether you belonged in the room. That man was Warren Greer. He wasn't cruel about it in any way you could document, and that's worth saying because it mattered later. He operated in implication, in tone, in the way he'd ask a question in a committee meeting that made every other person in the room reconsider the question they'd been about to ask. He was skilled at that, at making you feel slightly off balance without ever giving you a specific moment to point to. The kind of person who can make you doubt your own competence in a 2-minute conversation and then compliment your work in front of the dean the following week without contradiction, and somehow both things feel entirely like him. I remember a specific moment during my dissertation defense. I'd been presenting for about 40 minutes, feeling as prepared as I'd ever felt for anything, when Greer stopped me mid-sentence and asked a question about my sampling methodology that seemed designed to destabilize rather than clarify. The way he phrased it suggested an error I hadn't made. The other committee members shifted slightly in their chairs. I took a breath, walked through the methodology again, and answered it cleanly. He nodded once and didn't follow up. But the intention of the question was plain to anyone watching. That was how he'd always operated, not through attack, but through the subtle engineering of doubt. He used the implicit authority of his position the way some people use a scalpel, precisely, and with the minimum required force. I defended my dissertation successfully in spite of him, or maybe because of him, depending on how you want to read it. I got my position, I built my research program, and eventually I earned tenure. Over the next decade and a half, I published consistently. I brought in funding. I built collaborations across disciplines. I mentored graduate students through their own defenses. I built something I was genuinely proud of, the kind of slow accumulating career that doesn't have a single dramatic peak, but earns something durable over time. And somewhere in all of that, Warren Greer went from being the man who doubted me to the man who ran the department I worked in. There's a particular kind of irony in that. The person who'd once positioned himself to sit in judgment of your earliest work was now positioned above you again, in a different way, with a different kind of authority. And for most of those years, the arrangement was functional, professional. I knew how to navigate him. He knew where my limits were. We coexisted in the way that colleagues who've known each other a long time sometimes do. Not warmly, exactly, but without obvious friction. We were cordial in the hallways. We were collegial in faculty meetings. Whatever the dynamic had been 18 years earlier, it had settled into something manageable. That changed about 2 years before any of this became a crisis. 2 years before the grant, before the ethics board, before any of what I'm going to tell you. Dr. Greer called me into his office one afternoon and asked me for a copy of my research dataset. He framed it as a departmental need. He said he was compiling resources for an accreditation review and wanted to demonstrate the breadth of faculty research output. He used phrases like institutional visibility and methodological range across the department. It sounded entirely reasonable, the kind of request a department chair would make without thinking twice. I gave it to him. A full copy of the dataset, complete with the documentation file that explained how the variables were constructed and coded. I didn't ask any clarifying questions, and I didn't make any special note of the exchange beyond the email thread itself. I sent it over and moved on. I've thought about that moment a lot since then. The ease of it, the complete absence of any instinct to pause or ask for more context. He was my department chair. He was my former dissertation committee member. He was someone who had known my work for nearly 2 decades, who'd sat in the room when I defended it, who'd asked pointed questions about my methodology during that defense. There was no version of that request, in that context, that would have read as threatening. He was asking for my research the way a colleague asks for your notes, casually, briefly, with an air of mild administrative necessity. That was the first mistake they made in writing. Not the email itself, though the email mattered enormously later. The mistake was that he asked at all, because asking created a record. The email I sent him with the dataset attached had a timestamp. It had a subject line. It had a file attachment that documented exactly what I'd sent and when and to whom. At the time, I barely registered any of this as meaningful. But emails don't stop existing just because you stop thinking about them. They sit in servers and sent mail folders, in archived inboxes, waiting with the same quiet patience that paper waits in a file drawer. That email was still there 2 years later. Every word of it. I want to tell you what it felt like to work under Greer during the year that followed that dataset request, because the shift in his behavior was real. I just didn't name it correctly at the time. He started scheduling one-on-one meetings with me. Not departmental check-ins, not annual review conversations. Just the two of us. His office. No formal agenda circulated beforehand. He'd say it was to touch base, to make sure we were aligned on priorities. And within the first few minutes of every one of these meetings, he'd steer toward my research, specifically toward my methodology. The questions he asked were oddly precise. He wanted to know why I'd chosen a particular analytical framework over the alternatives I'd presumably considered. He wanted to understand how I'd weighted certain variables and whether those weights held across different sample configurations. He asked about the theoretical justification for specific methodological decisions. Decisions buried deep in the research. Decisions you'd only know to ask about if you'd read the full document carefully and were trying to understand it from the inside out. He was walking himself through it. That's what I understand now. He was confirming his own comprehension, testing whether he understood the work well enough to present it credibly in his own voice to a grant committee. At the time, I read it as his usual management style. He'd always been someone who needed to demonstrate mastery, who needed to show that he understood your work as well as you did, if not better. It read like performance. I didn't read it as preparation. I remember one particular meeting. A February afternoon, gray outside, the kind of Houston winter that can't decide what it is. He asked me something about a variable weighting decision that I'd made early in the study design. I explained my reasoning. He nodded slowly and asked a follow-up question that reframed the same decision in slightly different language, as if he were trying out how it sounded another way. I answered again. He nodded again. I left the meeting feeling faintly unsettled without being able to say why. There was a moment, leaving one of those meetings, I think it was the third or fourth one, when I stopped in the hallway and just stood there for a second. One of my graduate students, a second year named Marcus, was walking toward me from the other direction and asked if I was all right. I said yes, I was just thinking. He nodded and kept walking. But that pause in the hallway is something I remember clearly, because some part of me was already registering that something was off. Not suspicion exactly, more like a low-frequency noise you can't quite locate. Present, faintly discordant, not loud enough to identify. I filed it away. I kept teaching, kept writing, kept doing the things that make up a working academics week, and Greer kept scheduling meetings. I know why now. The following March, I did something that I've thought about hundreds of times since. Not because it was strategic, not because I suspected anything, but because of how completely ordinary it felt. I registered a copyright on my unpublished research. This isn't standard practice for most academics. Most researchers either assume their institution holds sufficient protection, plan to register once they publish and then forget about it, or simply aren't aware that the process exists for unpublished work. I did it because a colleague in the law school had given a faculty lunch talk about intellectual property and pre-publication research protection, and something in his framing stayed with me past the end of the talk. He'd said specifically that for unpublished work, U.S. Copyright Office registration was the only mechanism that created a clear, time-stamped, legally recognizable authorship claim before a work appeared in print. He was speaking generally, not to me, not about any specific situation. But I went back to my office that afternoon and started the online process. It took about 2.5 hours. I completed the registration form through the Copyright Office's online portal, uploaded the full research document, paid the filing fee, and submitted it. I received the digital confirmation immediately. Registration number, date of registration, title of the work, my name as the author of record. The physical certificate arrived a few weeks later. A single printed page, clean and official, standard format, everything on it plainly stated. I looked at it for maybe 30 seconds. I put it in a manila folder and placed it in the second drawer of my filing cabinet. Then I emailed the digital confirmation to myself. Subject line containing the registration number so I could search for it later, and went back to work. That was the whole event. 2.5 hours, one folder, one self-addressed email, one sheet of paper in a drawer. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't mention it to Greer or to anyone in the department. I didn't think it required mentioning. It was routine paperwork, the kind of thing you do because it seems professionally responsible and then set aside and mostly forget about. I want to be specific about this because it's the part of the story that matters most practically. I was not a person who suspected Warren Greer of anything at that particular moment. The dataset request had been 2 years earlier. The methodology meetings were ongoing, but I'd rationalized them as his style. When I sat down at my computer and started the copyright registration process that Tuesday afternoon, I was not thinking about him. I was not thinking about protection or evidence or any future proceeding. I was acting on something a law school colleague had said at a lunch talk because it had seemed sensible and the task was manageable. That's all it was. A sensible task on an available afternoon. 8 months later, Dr. Warren Greer submitted that research to a federal grant committee under his own name. The grant was for $1,900,000. He listed himself as the principal investigator on work whose methodology, dataset structure, theoretical framework, and written analysis were entirely mine. Registered, time-stamped, and documented in the federal copyright system from the previous March. The lie worked until the paperwork caught up. I didn't find out from him. I found out the way you find out a lot of things in an academic department, through a chain of hallway conversations and forwarded information that eventually wound its way to the person it most directly concerned. A colleague in an adjacent department had been involved in a review process that included grant submissions before final award decisions. She read the proposal. She recognized the methodology immediately because she'd attended a conference session where I'd presented on exactly this research 18 months earlier. She came to my office, closed the door, and asked me something I wasn't expecting. "James, did you co-author that grant with Warren?" I told her I had not. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. She turned her laptop toward me. I don't have a clean or simple way to describe what it felt like to read it. Not shock exactly. Something colder, something slower than shock. More like a suspicion you've been carrying without consciously naming it, finally acquiring a solid form. The research was mine. Not similar to mine, not loosely inspired by mine. Mine. The structure was mine. The methodology section was mine. The theoretical scaffolding, the analytical approach, the specific language I'd developed over years of working in this area, language that had a particular character to it that I'd recognize anywhere. All of it was there. His name was on the cover page. His institutional biography was in the appendix. In the acknowledgement section, there was a single line referring to departmental research resources, which I understood almost immediately as his way of accounting for the dataset he'd asked me for 2 years earlier. My name appeared nowhere in the document. I went back to my office. I sat down, and I opened the second drawer of my filing cabinet. I took out the manila folder. I pulled out the copyright registration receipt. 1 page, my name at the top, my research title, the registration date. I set it on the desk next to the printed grant proposal. I looked at both dates. The registration date was 8 months before the grant submission date. I sat with that for a long time. It would be easy to frame what followed as a moment of righteous clarity, sudden resolve, the clean knowledge of exactly what to do. That's not quite right. It was quieter than that, more tired than angry. There was something that felt almost like a specific kind of sadness in it. Not for me, or not only for me, but for what the situation said about a man I'd known for 20 years, for the patience it implied, for the calculation. For the months of methodology meetings, the careful questions, the studied absorption of someone else's intellectual work. He'd taken something that belonged to me and he'd planned it, and he'd believed he could. I sat with that, and then I thought about what I was going to do next. There's a version of this story where what happens next is a confrontation. Going to his office, putting the receipt on his desk, demanding he explain himself in front of witnesses. Something immediate and unambiguous that communicates the full force of what you know. I didn't do that. I did not need to expose them. I only needed to stop protecting them. Because what I understood, sitting at that desk, was that for years I had been part of a collective institutional habit of not naming what I saw around Greer, the absorbed ideas in faculty meetings that appeared later in his papers, the junior faculty members whose language showed up in his presentations, the way he'd steer a graduate student's research in a direction that happened to align with work he was developing. I'd seen it. A lot of people had seen it. We'd all filed it under "that's how he operates" and kept working, because the cost of naming it was high and uncertain, and he was still the chair the next day. That collective habit was what had allowed the pattern to develop and deepen over years. I was not going to go to his office. I was going to document him. But before I filed anything, I needed to understand whether what had happened to me was isolated or whether it was part of something that had happened before. I called a colleague I'll refer to as Dr. Reyes because she's asked me not to use her name. She'd been junior faculty in our department for about 12 years before leaving for another institution 4 years prior. The circumstances of her departure had always been vague in the way that certain departures are. She'd given the standard professional answers about opportunities and new directions, the language people use when they've decided not to say what actually happened. We'd stayed loosely in touch over the years, a few emails a year, brief conversations at conferences when we happened to overlap. I called her on a Wednesday evening, about a week after I'd found the grant proposal. I laid out everything I'd discovered, the copyright date, the methodology, the acknowledgement line. I told her I was trying to understand whether this was an isolated incident or a pattern with a longer history. She was quiet for a long time, and then she described her curriculum framework. 4 years before she left the department, she had developed an original approach to mentoring first-generation college students through undergraduate STEM research programs. She'd spent 3 full semesters building it, refining it, documenting outcomes. It was careful, original work. She presented it at a full departmental faculty meeting. Greer was in the room. He asked questions. 18 months later, he applied for a continuation grant for the Undergraduate Research Initiative. The application described her curriculum framework in precise detail. He was listed as the architect. She appeared under faculty participants. She hadn't registered a copyright. She hadn't kept documentation in a form that would have been legally meaningful. When she raised it informally with the dean's office, she was told that attribution in collaborative departmental contexts was difficult to adjudicate. The implication was plain. Let it go. She let it go. And then she left. I kept thinking, she told me, that the right approach was a direct conversation, that if I explained clearly what had happened, the right people would understand. I thought the facts were self-evident, but facts without paperwork aren't facts in any formal sense. They're your account of events, and his account of events was the one with his name printed at the top of a document. There was a pause. I should have made a record, she said. That's the only thing I would change. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the particular cruelty of a situation where the facts are clear to every person involved, where the person who did the work knows it, the person who took the credit knows it, and yet the absence of documentation means the institutional machinery has nothing to engage with. The truth exists, it just has nowhere formal to land. I thought about what it must have cost her, not just professionally, but personally. To have built something original, to have seen it absorbed and renamed, and to have walked away because the alternative was a fight she couldn't win without the paperwork she didn't have. And I thought about what it meant that she'd been an earlier case, that the pattern had worked on her, that its success had given him the confidence to attempt it again, this time with research worth $1.9 million federal dollars and a researcher who happened to have a receipt. The receipt was dated. The alibi was not. This is what I understood after that conversation about how Greer had operated for so many years without facing any formal accountability. He'd built his ability to do this on a very specific assumption, that the people he took from would either lack the documentation to contest his version of events, or would decide that using whatever documentation they had wasn't worth the professional risk of going up against a department chair. That assumption had held up over and over across years, possibly across the entirety of his time as chair. Dr. Reyes was one example. I suspected there were others. Junior faculty who'd moved on quietly, visiting researchers who'd left without explanation, graduate students whose methodological work had appeared in grant proposals without attribution, and who'd had no institutional mechanism to address it. Every time it had worked, the assumption deepened. Every time someone decided to absorb the loss and keep working, the pattern became more practiced, the confidence more entrenched. He'd refined it into something smooth, something that operated in the plausible middle ground between collaboration and appropriation, in the institutional gray zone where complex attribution questions live. He'd learned exactly how far he could go and still maintain the vagueness that protected him. He'd just never encountered someone who had a receipt. I spent the 2 weeks after my call with Dr. Reyes building the file, not from anger or not primarily from anger, but from the same methodical care I'd bring to any research project. I was constructing an argument, and arguments require evidence in sequence. I pulled the copyright registration receipt from the folder in my filing cabinet. I pulled the confirmation email I'd sent myself in March. Subject line containing the registration number, timestamp clearly visible. I printed the full grant proposal, every page, and placed it side by side with a printed copy of my research document. I went through them in parallel, section by section. The parallels were extensive. In several passages, the language was reproduced nearly verbatim. The dataset structure was identical. The methodological framework was mine from the foundational assumptions outward. I pulled the email from 2 years earlier, his request for the dataset, and my reply with the file attached. Subject line, timestamp, file name in the attachment field. And then I went into my email archive and pulled the calendar invitations for every one-on-one meeting Greer had scheduled in the period before the grant submission deadline. Every meeting with no formal agenda. Every meeting that had steered, within the first few minutes, toward a specific conversation about my methodology. Those invitations had dates. Placed against a reasonable grant development timeline, they mapped onto the preparation period in a way that needed no interpretation. I assembled everything into a clean, organized file, and I spent a week deciding whether I was going to file a formal complaint with the ethics board. I want to be direct about that hesitation because it was real. Warren Greer was still my department chair. He still held structural authority over aspects of my professional life that mattered to me. Course assignments, space allocations, the letters of support that go in grant applications, the internal reputation that shapes whether your ideas get institutional traction. Filing a formal complaint against your department chair is not a neutral act. There was a version of this where the board reviewed the documentation, found the attribution questions complex enough to avoid a clear determination, and I continued to work under a man who now knew I'd tried to take him down formally. That was a real possibility. I had to look at it directly. But I kept coming back to Dr. Reyes, to the way she'd said I should have made a record. Not bitterly, just factually. The clean regret of someone who'd understood something important a few years too late. And I thought about the people I didn't know about, the ones who'd made the same calculations she had and walked away without documentation. Every one of those decisions had made the next instance more likely. And now I was sitting here with a receipt dated 8 months before a $1.9 million federal grant application filed under the wrong name. If I filed the documents away and said nothing, I was just another entry in the pattern. I filed the complaint. I attached every document, organized chronologically. I wrote a factual narrative of the sequence of events with dates, sources, and document references. No characterization of his intentions, just the timeline. The ethics board was its own process. I didn't need to be the one who pronounced the verdict. I needed to be the one who put the evidence in front of the people whose job it was to evaluate it. I'll tell you something about the days between filing and the first board meeting. They were strange days to live through. I went to my classes, I held office hours, I had a dissertation chapter to read for a third-year student, and I read it. On the outside, nothing had changed. My office was the same office, the hallways were the same hallways, and Warren Greer was still 2 doors down from the department administrative suite with his name on the door. I saw him once, in the faculty lounge, about 4 days after I'd filed. He was pouring coffee and talking to 2 junior colleagues about a conference he was attending. He looked entirely ordinary. He looked like a man who had no particular reason to be unsettled. And I thought, he probably doesn't know yet. He probably won't know until the board contacts him. And I felt, in that moment, something I can only describe as the strange quiet of a decision already made. I'd set the process in motion. Whatever happened next would happen through the evidence. The board convened about 3 weeks later. I appeared to present the materials. I brought 1 clean printed set of everything, labeled and tabbed. I'd been told I'd have approximately 45 minutes. I didn't give a speech. I didn't make an argument about what his actions had meant to me personally, or about 20 years of work, or about what it felt like to open a grant proposal and not find my name in it. I laid the documents on the table in the order they'd been created, and I explained what each one demonstrated: the copyright registration and the March date, the self-addressed confirmation email, the grant proposal with his name on work I'd authored, the side-by-side methodology comparison, the dataset email from 2 years prior, the calendar invitations from the months before the submission deadline. I let the record speak. There's something I want to say about how it felt to sit in that room with the board. I'd prepared thoroughly. I knew the documents cold. But the experience of presenting them formally to a committee whose job was to evaluate exactly this kind of situation was different from anything I'd imagined in the weeks leading up to it. There was no theater to it, no drama, just a table, 6 people with notebooks, and a sequence of documents being placed one at a time in front of the people who had the authority to act on what they showed. That plainness, that procedural ordinariness, was somehow the most clarifying thing about the whole experience. It had been reduced to what it actually was: evidence and the people empowered to evaluate it. Greer was called the following week. I wasn't present for his appearance. Ethics procedures don't allow it, but I've been told by someone who was in the room that when the committee chair placed the copyright receipt next to the grant cover sheet and asked him to explain the 8-month gap, there was a silence that lasted noticeably longer than silences usually last in formal institutional settings. He attempted several explanations. He said my research had been part of collaborative departmental work that he'd formalized and submitted. He said attribution in academic grant proposals was a complex area where common conventions didn't always reflect the full picture of contribution. He said the dataset had been provided to him as a shared departmental resource. The committee chair asked him to produce any written evidence of that collaborative understanding: an email, a memo, an agreement. Any document, any piece of written communication predating the grant submission that established a shared authorship arrangement or that characterized the dataset as a departmental resource rather than an individual contribution. He couldn't produce any of it because none of it existed. The committee chair pointed out that the email exchanging the dataset was a private 2-person exchange in which he had made a specific request and I had fulfilled it, with no mention of shared use or collaborative work. She pointed out that the copyright registration predated the submission by 8 months. She noted that the calendar records showed a pattern of one-on-one meetings focused specifically on methodology during the period when grant materials would typically be under development. She asked if he had anything further to offer. He did not. I was sitting in my office when the call came through. Mid-afternoon, flat white Houston light coming through the window. I'd been at my desk for about an hour. I'd taken the copyright receipt out of the folder that morning. I don't know exactly why. some combination of restlessness and waiting. I'd set it on the corner of my desk. I'd been glancing at it between other tasks. This plain single page, standard copyright form, my name and the research title and the registration date. The call lasted about 8 minutes. The board chair told me the committee had found sufficient grounds to recommend reversal of the grant award. She told me that a formal attribution review would be conducted, and that pending its completion, the grant would be reassigned to the correct principal investigator. She told me that Dr. Greer had been placed on administrative review pending further proceedings. I thanked her. I set the phone down. I picked up the receipt and held it. Karma did not arrive loudly. It arrived with proof. Not through some cosmic reckoning or a moment of public exposure or a speech that finally reached the right audience. It arrived as a committee chair reading 2 dates on 2 documents and asking a question that 2 decades of professional standing couldn't answer. It arrived as the paperwork, assembled across years and months by habits and decisions that seemed unremarkable at the time, doing exactly what paperwork does when someone finally lays it out in order. The grant was reassigned to me. $1,900,000 federal funding, my name on it as the principal investigator on research I had actually written. Warren Greer remained on administrative review. He did not return to the department chair position. The specifics of what followed are institutional. The kind of proceedings that occur through HR channels and committee processes and formal documentation, not in public. But the professional standing he'd built, the reputation for intellectual leadership, the identity as the person who shaped the direction of the department. None of it survived the review process. The authority he'd accumulated had been built in part on the consistent absence of a paper trail. Once the paper trail existed, so did the pattern. A few months after everything resolved, I went to a frame shop near campus. I bought a plain, dark wood frame, the inexpensive kind they keep in a stack near the register. I brought the copyright receipt home, fitted into the frame, and put it on the shelf in my office next to the window, right where the afternoon light catches it, not as a trophy, not as anything directed at him, as a reminder of a Tuesday afternoon in March, an afternoon I barely remember because nothing about it felt significant. When I spent 30 minutes on online forms and a filing fee and created the most consequential document in a 12-month sequence of events. I've spent a long time thinking about what the lesson actually is here, because I don't want to give you something simple about a situation that wasn't simple. You could say the lesson is, always document everything. That's true, but it's incomplete, because most of us can't document everything all the time. And the documentation I'm describing was a copyright registration and a self-addressed email with a registration number in the subject line. It was genuinely unremarkable. It wasn't born of distrust or strategic thinking. It was Tuesday afternoon administrative housekeeping that happened to create a record. You could say the lesson is, powerful people will exploit what you don't protect. That's also true, but it still misses something. What I keep coming back to is something quieter than a lesson. An observation about how institutional justice works when it works correctly. It doesn't usually work through climactic exposure or public confrontation or someone finally saying the right thing to the right person at the right moment. It works through records, through timestamps, through the accumulation of small, bureaucratic, completely unexciting acts that nobody found worth noting at the time, and which collectively constitute something an impartial process can evaluate. Greer had spent years operating in the space between what happened and what could be proven. He'd come to understand that space well. He knew its dimensions. He knew that attribution questions in academic contexts were reliably complex, that institutions defaulted toward protecting their senior people in the absence of clear documentation, that the researchers most likely to have been harmed were also the researchers least likely to have the standing or the records to do anything about it. He'd built his approach around all of that, and it had worked consistently enough that the possibility of a clean paper trail felt remote. He'd built a system for a world where people didn't keep their receipts. He was living in a world where one person did. Not because I suspected him, Not because I was protecting myself from a threat I'd identified, because a colleague in the law school gave a faculty lunch talk and something in it lodged, and on an afternoon in the following March, I had 2.5 free hours and I used them. That's the part I want you to hold on to, because there's a tendency, when a story like this resolves the way mine did, to read it backward. To assume there was a strategy, a foresight, a deliberate self-protection that created the outcome. There wasn't. There was a habit. There was a small, ordinary Tuesday afternoon task. And there was the fact that once it existed permanently, with a date on it, and it didn't stop existing just because I stopped thinking about it. I called Dr. Reyes after the resolution was announced. She'd heard through mutual contacts. These things travel in academic circles. She said she was glad. She said she'd thought about her own situation more than she'd expected to, even years after she'd made peace with leaving. I kept thinking, she told me again, that there was a human solution. A direct conversation, the right explanation, the right person in the dean's office who'd understand what had happened. I thought if I was clear enough, someone would see it. But institutions see documents. They don't see what you remember. They see what you can show them. She's right. And the gap between understanding that intellectually and having the document in your hand when you need it, that's the entire story. Everything else is consequence. I want to say something about what it felt like after the grant was reassigned, because there's a version of this kind of story where the resolution arrives and everything feels clean, vindication with a clear edge to it. I didn't quite feel that. What I felt, more than anything, was tired in a specific way. The tiredness of someone who had spent months carrying something heavy and had finally been allowed to set it down. And beneath that, something I can only describe as a kind of grief for the 20 years I'd known Warren Greer. Not for our relationship, which had never been warm, but for what the whole thing revealed about how he'd chosen to operate, for all that time, in a building where I worked, where people I respected worked, where the work itself was supposed to be the thing that mattered. There was also, underneath everything else, an unmistakable clarity about what had made the outcome possible. Not my anger, not my reputation, not the loyalty of colleagues or the persuasiveness of my account. A Tuesday afternoon, a filing fee, 30 minutes. The fact that records exist as long as they're kept, and that they carry the same weight on the day you need them as they carried on the day you created them. That's the quiet, unglamorous, completely reliable thing at the center of this story. I look at the receipt in its frame every time I sit down at my desk. Some days I barely register it. Some days I look at it for a few seconds longer than necessary. What I see isn't him. What I see is a Tuesday afternoon, a law school colleague's faculty lunch talk, a filing fee, 30 minutes of an ordinary workday. What I see is the unglamorous reality of how institutional accountability works when it works. Slowly, through paperwork, through formal processes that nobody films, through the reading aloud of documents that someone filed in a drawer months or years before they understood why. What I see is the difference between knowing something and being able to prove it, and the narrow, specific, administrative bridge that connects the two. Warren Greer knew my work. He'd known it for 2 decades. He'd received my dataset over email. He'd spent months in those meetings absorbing the methodology. He understood the research well enough to present it credibly to a grant committee. He believed that understanding constituted something he could use. But the copyright receipt had my name on it, and the registration date was 8 months before his submission date. And those two facts, placed next to each other on a table in a formal proceeding, constituted a question that no amount of professional standing could answer. That's not luck. That's documentation. That's a record meeting the institutional process designed to evaluate exactly that kind of evidence. The paperwork did what paperwork does when the facts are real and the dates are honest. And sometimes, that's the most reliable thing there is. And if stories like this remind you that truth has a longer memory than lies, subscribe to my channel for more stories. Because sometimes karma is just the evidence finally being read aloud. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone in a position of authority take credit for work you produced, slowly, carefully, in ways that were hard to prove, until something you had done without thinking twice became the proof? Tell me what that looked like. Drop it in the comments below, because you might find that you're not the only one, and that turns out to matter more than you'd expect.